This is John Drabinski, and you're listening to the Black Studies Podcast, a Mellon Grant-sponsored series of conversations examining the history of the field. Our conversations engage with a wide range of activists and scholars, senior figures in the field, lay doctoral students, and everyone in between, culture workers and political organizers, in order to explore the cultural and political meaning of Black studies as an area of inquiry and its critical methods. Today's conversation is with Alex Lubin, who teaches in the Department of African American Studies at Penn State University and is the president-elect of the American Studies Association. His work is informed by cultural studies and history, with specific focus on North Africa and the Arab world more broadly. He is the author of Romance and Rights, The Politics of Interracial Intimacy, 1945 to 1956, Geographies of Liberation, The Making of an Afro-Arab Political Imaginary, and Never-Ending War on Terror. And he is completing a book entitled Third World Ensemble, African Americans in Cairo Between the Suez and Six-Day Wars. In this discussion, we explore the place of transnational study in Black studies, the new horizons opened up by the study of non-Atlantic roots of diaspora, and the fecundity of Black study as an undisciplined, expansive, and curious practice. Alex, how are you today?
Hi, I'm doing well. Thanks for having me.
Well, welcome to the Black Studies Podcast. This is a real treat to have you on the podcast. I think your work is really interesting and really important. You know, your blend of history, area studies, cultural studies is just, in some ways for me, really exemplary of the kind of adventurousness and rigor that Black studies makes possible. And, so anytime we get people who have PhDs in non-disciplines who also work in non-disciplines, I also think it's a really interesting perspective. So all that's to say, welcome, and I really appreciate your time and look forward to the conversation.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here and look forward to our talk.
So let me start, before we get into the questions of Black studies and your work and the relationships between all of these things, I want to ask you a question just about your own journey as an intellectual and really as a person, obviously, as well. You know, what drew you to the study of Black life? What got you interested in Black studies? And for me, always this important element, what sustained you in relation to that work?
Mm-hmm. Well, I've always been, as you indicated in the brief intro, kind of an undisciplined scholar. And I mean that in both the sort of broad ways that can mean someone who's interested in various fields of knowledge production, but also as someone who is kind of wandering through higher ed disciplines and fields. And so I come out of a undergraduate college experience where I feel really privileged that there were no majors, there were no disciplines, and there were no grades. This is
Hampshire?
No, it's like Hampshire. It was the Evergreen State College in Olympia, Washington, where not only did they produce the great graphic artist Linda Berry and Matt Groening, but we also had a band that played in our dorm called Nirvana. So it was an exciting moment. And
I'm sorry, can I interrupt you?
Please.
This is like improv on the improvisation on the podcast. What year did you graduate?
I graduated from Evergreen in 1992.
I graduated from Seattle U in 1991.
Oh, hey.
Did you work on Washburn at all?
Yeah, I did.
All right. So at some point, we probably sat in one of those
hilarious.
grubby dorm rooms smoking cheap weed and talking about the Seattle scene. So anyway.
That's right. And
all right.
For me and my friends, we complained about this band that made all this noise in the dorm. Kurt Cobain didn't go to Evergreen, but he performed there. So,
I was at a party, actually, where I remember telling my friends afterwards, I was sitting on a couch next to Kurt Cobain, and later on, they were like, "Oh yeah, his band's really great," and I was like, "Man, it's like blue hair and
Exactly.
Red and pink." And I was just like, "Who's in a band? I mean, pull your shit together."
Right.
So I've always laughed at that, over the years, like that moment where he and I were sitting there smoking a joint on a couch at a party, and I was ridiculing his commitment to a band, and meanwhile, I ended up, semi-employed for years in academia while he changed culture. Anyway,
That's right.
Sorry.
That's right. So anyway, I think being in this experience where I was exposed to all sorts of thinking and histories and literatures, I was really struck there, and then by the ways that Black studies scholars and intellectuals and Black artists were articulating for me what were the contradictions that I was encountering in scholarship about the United States, a country, of course, that talked about its exceptionalism and valorized its commitments to liberal democracy, but also, of course, a country that practiced slavery and removal and genocide of indigenous people. And so that's the sort of what I see as the sort of contradictions at the heart of American studies or Africana studies as well. And I guess a thinker that was really influential to me as an undergraduate was Ralph Ellison, whose Shadow and Act sort of articulated the specific ways that that his moment of the post-World War II era was filled with the contradictions of what he called conscience and consciousness. And he called these burdens that were imposed upon Americans. So the ways that sort of equality and freedom were developed alongside Black unfreedom. And then I guess as I continued my academic journey into graduate school, I was really interested and taken up with labor history and debates in the 1990s within labor history between a sort of new left labor history that was really interested in moments of multiracial labor democracy. But I think within the new left labor history, there were often like these monographs often ended with, well, there was this moment and it fell apart because of the ways that race was used to divide the working class. But at the same time, when I was working with labor historians at another working class institution called UMass Boston for my master's degree, I was also reading this sort of new work in what we now might think of as critical race theory, but coming out of labor history, sort of Black scholars like Barbara J. Fields, who were talking about race and ideology in American history, or David Roediger, whose Wages of Whiteness, Race and the Making of the Working Class, or sort of an emphasis on the sort of British cultural studies scholars who were thinking about the ways that race was the modality through which class was lived, in Stuart Hall's terms. That was really eye-opening to me and sort of became a kind of meta-language for me to think about the fields that I was interested in and the questions that were interesting to me. So I went on to get a PhD in American Studies, and I specifically went to the University of Minnesota because I was interested in working with David Roediger, who sort of overlapped or was there for 3 or 4 or 5 years. I'm not sure how long he was there, but that's how long I was there. And I was really fortunate that it overlapped with him, but also his sort of readings of Black studies through courses on CLR James, through courses on Black labor history that sort of brought in figures like Robin Kelley and Stuart Hall and Hazel Carby. So that, and then sort of constituting a committee that included Black studies scholars at the University of Minnesota at the time, was really important to me. So this is a long-winded way of saying that I've been sort of cast about in different undisciplined academic formations, whether it's American studies departments or now an African American studies department. But I think the questions that have always been really illuminating to me and inspiring have been those that can be called Black studies and Black cultural studies specifically.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. And I love that tie of Evergreen State College. I mean, personal, playfulness aside, but starting from an institution that already is trying to blur these lines and to make undisciplined into a kind of rigor and particular kind of insight. So that continuity is super interesting and actually quite unique. I mean, I don't think sort of from college, I think most people have a moment in college in which they transition from college to graduate school or even postgraduate school where they engage this notion of undisciplined. But that's a really interesting sort of intellectual origin story of being undisciplined from the moment you step onto a campus. I really love that. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think we try to make sense of where we are in the moment, and that to me has been something that I can't say was very settling when I was going through it, right? Casting about some ways, wondering what did I want to do? Like history departments always seemed very rigorously disciplined in ways that didn't speak to me, whereas English departments, also seemed very disciplined in ways that didn't speak to me. And so I found a home in American studies. I found a home in conversations about Black studies. And I guess I would also say I found a home in international and global studies as well. So the question of the area studies that you raised has also been really important to how I think about where I fit and what kind of questions I'm interested in.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting. Thank you for that. It's one of my favorite parts of the podcast is hearing how people found their way into what they do. I just think that journey is actually always worth telling, and this is a really interesting one. So thank you for that. And let me pick up on the Black Studies part, right, and ask you how you imagine the field. How does it work in your imagination of what you're doing and how you're doing your research, your teaching, and so forth? And I specifically want to ask about your imagination of the field from the perspective of its origins, which had that tension built into it, where it was both an intellectual project of, the Black intellectual tradition and expressive culture weren't being taught, had never been a strong presence on university campuses. Black studies would be a place where that tradition and those expressive modalities would have a home where you could study it, where you could produce and reproduce scholarship and thinking and education. But at the same time, there was that demand, and I think this is really linked to its origins in the Bay Area, which I know is also your origins, which is it was also the moment of radical Black liberation struggle that had questioned this distinction between the classroom and the community, between the campus and education, and prescriptive demands, struggle, and militancy. So, Black Studies has always had that tension, that relationship from its origins between its political commitments to Black liberation and its prescriptive dimensions, that it intervenes, but also the contemplative, the world of ideas, intellectual life, and intellectual tradition. And so I'm interested in hearing how you imagine the field of Black Studies generally, but also how you see that in relation to this origin story that I think is really still with us when we think about the field.
Yeah, it's a big question, and obviously there's no singular definition of Black studies, as this podcast and all of its contributors can attest. And it certainly wouldn't be for me or just one person to define it. And so I guess you're asking me to think about sort of my conceptualization of it, which I'm happy to share. I think that Black studies is a set of theories and methods and praxis that has historically been made by and for Black people to understand the world and to survive and to thrive. And well before its institutionalization, of course, Black studies was being practiced in churches, barbershops, underground community spaces, houses containing libraries and archives, in music and folk songs, etc. And so in that regard is how I think of Black studies as a praxis of Black life. At the same time, it's one that I work through and think with as an act of solidarity against the ongoing debasement of Black life, but also in the recognition, I think, that Black studies offers resources for thinking freedom beyond where we are. And just to add a sort of personal note about the Bay Area as not an origin story for the field, but an origin story for me, is to say that, it was impossible to be growing up in Oakland, Berkeley, on that line without engaging with Black studies, even though as a kid and as a young adult, I didn't necessarily have the language or theory to do that. And I would say that's because my father moved us to the Bay Area from from Philadelphia in 1973 because he was a hematologist and a sickle cell doctor. And he worked with and alongside the Black Panther Party's sickle cell clinics. He was not a radical thinker. It was not necessarily a political act for him, but he was interested in care of Black children. And so because of that, I was always exposed to Black communities in Oakland, not only through his patients who came through our lives, but also we built a life that was engaging with those figures and those who I now know as intellectuals. And then on the other side, my mother also is a radical person and has led a radical life. I was not a red diaper baby, but I certainly grew up in a radical milieu where she was partnered both intellectually and personally after leaving my father with the Black communist mayor of Berkeley, California, Gus Newport, who had sort of crossed paths with Malcolm X in Rochester, New York. And someone who took delegations of Black radical thinkers like June Jordan and Angela Davis to places like Palestine and the West Bank. So I grew up thinking that these figures who came to my house, like Barbara Christian or June Jordan, were just local Bay Area figures, but
Wow.
ultimately came to recognize a sort of worldview or become exposed to a worldview, a Black studies praxis, if you will, that, spoke to certain contradictions and conjunctures that were really important to how I was thinking about the world. So my, exposure and my thought about what Black studies can be is shaped by the understanding that these everyday practices of Black life that I encountered growing up are a praxis that have a theory. And then the last thing I would just say about this, of course, is that someone whose path I encountered as a student, but not formally, was Cedric Robinson, who also has a sort of Oakland history, which I didn't know about until I came to meet him when he was in Santa Barbara. And, the story of how Cedric Robinson's interest in the Black radical tradition crossed paths with his partner, who is Lebanese, Elizabeth Robinson, and the ways that the sort of Middle East and Black studies intersected in his construction of the Black radical tradition certainly inspires and speaks to my interests as well. So that's a very long-winded story about my conception of the world of Black studies.
No, it's not long-winded at all, and it's super interesting. And, as you said at the outset, I'm a part of why Ashley and I asked this question as part of the series is because the question of how to understand or how to even, I don't even want to say define, but how to give some shape and contour to this phrase Black studies, I think is as important a question as any of us in the field can ask. In fact, one of my own takes, right, is, my PhD was in philosophy, and there's this thing that people say in philosophy that the only truly philosophical question is what is philosophy? And I think there's something about that the only truly Black studies question is what is Black studies? And that is a little bit of self-humor in philosophy, but it's also deeply true. And I also think that about Black studies. But what's interesting is hearing you talk, hearing people talk, by the time yours comes out, we'll be nearing 100 episodes. How many things converge and also how many other paths open up, and I think that's what an undisciplined, if you think about undisciplined, it has to coalesce around something, right, to give it some shape and contour. But if it's going to be an undisciplined field of study, those multiple paths have to be both affirmed and proliferated. And you really described so many ways that there is that proliferation, right? Even as we find our own little corner, right?
That's right. And what's interesting about what you just said to me is the ways that Black studies is something we think with, it's something we think through, it's something we think alongside with, it's a praxis that perhaps we engage. But it's not something always captured or institutionalized in our workplaces, even when we are in name working with and through it. So, I think that's an interesting conundrum.
Yeah, and I would add to that. I mean, it's a thing that, there's a reason why Ashley and I decided to do this series together, which is we are each other's colleague who is really deeply committed to the field of Black studies, and that way of having colleagues, right, or the way who are committed to that, to the field, and not just committed to a discipline that is a sort of applied to or takes on questions of Black people's lives. That commitment to Black studies, it's like the colleague relationship ends up being so interesting because, look, the two of us, me and Ashley, are very different in terms of the things that we study, but that commitment to the field, I think, makes the what is Black studies question of Black studies always interesting, because the institution is always going to actually ask for 6 things that make you distinctive, or, if 6, maybe 3 usually. So,
right.
Well, let me actually turn to your work, and you've talked about it a little bit, but, your work is this, you work in social and political history and cultural studies. That mixture is just, for me, such an important way of getting into the study of Black life. And so I'm interested to hear you reflect on your own work a little bit, and in this way. What do you think your work, or how do you think your work relates to the past of Black studies? Like, how does it fit in the history of the field? And what, if any, horizons do you see it opening up, and new boundaries that you see it pushing?
Mm-hmm. Well, I hope that my contribution to Black studies is by thinking with those traditions, or those part of the tradition of Black studies that have been committed to the global field and to internationalism. I agree, I would say, with scholars who have recognized that the field has always been global. That is to say that Black intellectuals have, from the jump, thought about the international terrain as a place for finding belonging, for thinking resources, for liberation, for thinking places of migration. So, this is an argument, it's not just mine to make, but one that I think Robin Kelley has made, which is to say that Black studies has always been a global field. My specific contribution, I hope, has been in sort of pushing some of the geographic and geopolitical boundaries of Black diasporic and internationalist work to include North Africa and the Middle East specifically. Mm-hmm. And in that regard, I think that I have had to confront a problematic, not a problem, but a problematic to work through, which is the centrality of the Atlantic world to conceptions of Black studies. I am certainly influenced by and intrigued with Black Atlantic, or the studies of the Black Atlantic, particularly Gilroy's conception of the Atlantic as a chronotope. But I think that Black studies asks different questions when it is engaged with other geopolitical realities, such as the Islamic world, and routes of migration, movement, enslavement, liberation that have linked African-descended people to the Middle East and North Africa in particular. Mm-hmm. I think that the countercultures of modernity that Gilroy and others identify in the Middle Passage are different when we route Black studies to different geopolitical realities. And that's not to undermine or challenge or say that, no, the Atlantic is wrong, or, not at all. Yeah. But it's to say that Black studies can sort of push the geopolitical boundaries into different geographies and realities. So what, for example, this is not my work, but moving beyond my work, right? My work is very focused on Egypt, modern Egypt, and Palestine, and the United Arab Republic, and the formation of the Third World Movement in the era of decolonization. But I'm also increasingly becoming interested in scholarship that's looking at the sort of the Red Sea and circulations of people around the Indian Ocean world, of Afro-descended people, that has also led to different kinds of epistemic and philosophical interventions into modernity, and sort of the kinds of Afrocentric, Black-centered conceptions of modernity that come from that. So I hope that's one of my contributions, is both to theorize what are the possibilities and limits of diaspora as a framework for thinking Black studies, as well as thinking about the possibilities and limits of internationalism and frameworks like solidarity for thinking Black studies, but then also pushing the boundaries of Eurocentric and Atlantic-centric conceptions of Black modernity beyond the Atlantic world.
Yeah, that was wonderful. And I think this, other waterways, other oceans, right? That means there's just such a shift in Black studies and, Indian Ocean studies, and just the Maghreb broadly, but also, as you say, the Mediterranean, Red Sea, all of these new. What's interesting to me is how they tell different, obviously they're going to tell different stories, and hopefully Black studies stays committed to that notion of expansiveness, so that there's a space for this kind of scholarship and encouragement of it. It does require a different kind of language skill, which is always interesting to me. But also the way I think so many figures, for me, I mean, now I'm talking a little bit about my own interests, but the figures of water, right, as the Atlantic and the Mississippi River, like what does it mean to shift to other figures of water, the Nile or the Congo, in a way that's not, I mean, I think the Nile's, in the sort of classic, Afrocentric traditions, the Nile has a significant place there, but thinking about it in these different routes, as you said, and in that way, drawing Gilroy into geographies that would be unfamiliar to him. But
that's right. I mean, the question, I think, or the issue for me is to take up Gilroy's routes, not routes, right?
Yeah.
But to explore new routes, right? And to think about an I can't say that word, but an archipelago of Black studies, right?
Yeah.
And, I want to just also point out about the limitations of my work is that I'm still an Americanist, right? And I'm still bounded and working through what our English and Complitz colleagues call Anglophone literatures. So I'm still interested in how U.S. intellectuals, American, Caribbean, hemispheric thinkers are engaging the global terrain. But And I recognize that there are fields of African studies or Indian Ocean world studies that are exceeding the kinds of work I can do, sure, and exploring routes through different epistemes and languages that I don't have access to. So, while I can sort of romanticize the global terrain, I recognize my own limitations as an Americanist working within it.
Yeah, no, when I said, it's funny because when I said roots, that's how I pronounce R-O-U-T-E-S. R-O-O-T, I pronounce as rut, but that's why it's better to write sometimes about these. But yeah, the routes, as right, you put it, the better pronunciation. But I like that, you said the limits of your research, and I think that Black studies I think a Black Studies sensibility of understanding limits, right, and corners rather than proclamations about humankind or the subject and these kinds of things are actually its strength. But that strength gets tested when new geographies are introduced because they become really unfamiliar histories, and they become, as you said, a different counter narrative, and introducing different counter narratives ends up being a counter narrative to the field itself. But if it's a field that's committed to expansiveness, then this horizon that your research is pushing, it makes the field bigger and better. So I love that.
Thanks.
So let me ask you, and you've spoken to this in some ways, but I'm interested, your PhD was in American Studies, and although you have an affiliation, or as we were talking beforehand, 25% in the history department, you are, an African American Studies professor. So in that way, and also back to college, right? You haven't worked through a discipline, and have worked in these variations on undisciplined approaches. And I'm interested to hear you talk a little bit about how you think that's impacted your scholarship, how you do scholarship, but also I'm always interested in how it impacts your classroom, how you teach, how you construct a syllabus, how you construct, the presentation of an idea in and out of the classroom.
Right. I think that I'm not necessarily committed to a discipline, but I may be committed to a methodology. And that is to say that I am someone who comes out of sort of the cultural studies moment of thinking about texts broadly and always historicizing them. I come out of fields and methods that focus on popular and mass culture as well as literature and historical archives. But I'm also someone who thinks historically and who likes to historicize all these moments and understands moments of potential and moments of possible radical change, and thinks about what Gramsci and others think of as sort of conjunctural moments that are ripe for radical possibilities. So how that translates to the classroom is that I think I'm always bringing in different kinds of archival materials. I'm also sort of thinking about specific moments as sort of histories that are always fugitive. That is to say, things that could have been or provisional, rather in addition to that which was and actually happened. We like to think about in my classes what could have been possible in this moment and why didn't it happen, right? What does the archive not reveal? What are the absences within the archive? How was the archive itself produced by a moment of race making, for example? So in that regard, I think that I am, I'm always committed to understanding sort of where I am institutionally located at a particular moment. So when I'm in an African American Studies department, clearly I am engaging with the historiography of Black studies, and particularly of African American histories. So I'm teaching Intro to African American History now, and we are following the textbooks that guide us through that history. But at the same time, I'm encouraging students to think beyond what I think of as the exceptionalism of the U.S. story, and to think about how certain aspects of Black history reveal counter-histories to the African American story. So, for example, while our textbook is routing students right now from African empires through the Middle Passage, through the Caribbean to North America, we are also, for example, looking at the archive of enslaved people who were taken to Brazil and other parts of Latin America, which, as you know, is a much larger percentage of the Middle Passage. And then we're asking ourselves, how do we tell the story of the Middle Passage? What archival sources can reveal it? What sorts of contemporary art and visual practices help us think about the feelings or the affects of the Middle Passage? So, yeah, this is an undisciplined approach from the perspective that we're not just looking at the archive and the historiography, but we're also thinking through how meaning is made in cultural artifacts and visual culture and popular culture, how memory functions. And I think those, for me, are sort of questions that come through a sort of British cultural studies practice. It's thinking about how meaning is articulated in particular historical formations.
Listening to you talk through that question, I am struck by how we were definitely graduate educated in the same era, because I love these ways of framing questions around culture and evidence, really. But also, especially when you talked about, how do you communicate, to students, and how do you get them to think about the Middle Passage and that movement outside of documents and ledgers, but towards, as you said, like contemporary practices of the imagination, right? Fabulation and so forth. That's for me is always one of the signature features of Black studies. It's that explosion of what evidence is and what it means to think, not just to document, but what it means to think about these elements of the past. That was really well put. Thank you for that.
Thanks. I would just say one thing about the vintage that you and I both have in academia.
I hate being a vintage, but I am.
Sorry, I think it's a vintage though, John.
It's true.
Because we, at least I come out of a moment of training that was really interested in sort of anti-essentialist understandings of racial formations.
Yeah.
That was really interested in sort of Gilroy's against race, right? Or Hall's anti-essentialist notion of identity formation and articulation. And I have to say that I'm feeling like students that I work with now, graduate students, are much less tolerant of that moment of Black studies than I was. That is to say that they are much more interested in a maybe more trans-historical or even static notion of Blackness that's less, that has less patience for thinking about race as an ideological formation.
I could not agree more. It's a little triggering for you to say that, but yes. But I mean, that's what's very interesting about being a teacher, right? Being an educator across time is encountering these shifts. But also, I mean, I think somebody like Gilroy, or Hall, or if we go, for me, so my entry into a lot of this thinking is Gayatri Spivak's work. Mm-hmm. That anti-essentialism, the way essentialism has come to mean the sort of virtue of identity, right? And without an essentialism, somehow everybody is just a human. It's like, no, anti-essentialism was also an anti-humanism for a lot of folks. And I think when they get it, they're like, wow, the whole world shifts and changes. And I was like, yeah, that's me walking around, but I think that the pushback can get really interesting when cultivated into a productive discussion. And I think generationally, scholars are going to have really great exchanges around this because, I don't know about you, but my students will hear me out and then formulate new arguments that definitely are not, they're not interested in conversion, nor am I a person who converts. But
that's right. And I'm not saying that my way is the right way, but I am recognizing to what extent it was a product of a moment of, on the one hand, sort of national in the U.S. colorblindness and the ascendance of a sort of critical race theory that is now under attack, not only, I think, from a neoconservative movement, but perhaps also from fields of scholarship that saw that anti-essentialist movement as somehow less radical, or I don't even know what. I'm still working through what the critique is.
Yeah, that phrase colorblindness, poison the well on a lot of these conversations, for sure.
Mm-hmm.
I am actually colorblind, like physically colorblind, which my students love to have a good laugh. They always think they're the first people to laugh about the white black studies professor who's colorblind. But I'm like, no, from the beginning, this has been a joke. Well, let me ask you a sort of big question about the field. What do you think that Black Studies has done well, and what do you think it has not done particularly well?
I mean, I think that Black Studies is and has been a resource for thinking our way out of the present morass because of its commitment to thinking with and through the contradictions of global capitalism. I mean, that's a lot of words, but essentially, I think that its critique of racial capitalism remains, and maybe today we could think of gendered racial capitalism, remains a resource, a cipher for thinking about not just the national, but the global conjuncture. And at its most radical moments, when it expands its reach globally, I think that Black Studies is a way to think about the possibilities of solidarity and internationalism. So it helps us think about the conjunctures of war and genocide on the one hand, and perhaps climate catastrophes on the other. And Black Studies is not exclusive in doing that, but certainly its theories and methods, the ways that its practitioners have thought about the contradictions of their moments, are extremely important, and remain what those labor historians that I used to admire studying talked about as a usable past. Mm-hmm. Right? We need sort of histories of the possible. We need histories that are fugitive. We need usable pasts to sort of understand where we are now, both to buttress ourselves against the sort of fascist and totalitarian moment that we may be entering or are in, as well as to understand resources and strategies for survival and living that are not that don't capitulate to those forces. So that's what I think its possibilities are. That's why I think it's such a rich praxis to think with and engage with. I guess where I see possible limits are when it becomes sort of bounded by sort of national tropes of liberalism or neoliberalism, perhaps. I think that Black Studies is, as a practice, thinking against its institutionalization in the academy. And I think that we're in a moment where Black Studies praxis is seen as anathema or too risky or too dangerous for university administrations to permit. And so a kind of Black Studies that is really about providing student services primarily to ostracized Black students, and is a limited form of Black Studies. But I fear that that's the one that the academy can address, or wants, right? A Black Studies that is about sort of claiming a commitment to Black students and faculty, perhaps, but one that isn't actually engaged with its praxis and its possibilities.
Really interesting. Thank you. That was fantastic. I mean, it's a common theme across this podcast, and I just think it's I don't know if it's a paradox, a complexity, what word we want to use for it, but what does it mean to be Black Studies, which has been an anti-disciplinary, in some ways anti-institutional modality of thinking and organizing questions and answering questions? What does it mean to be institutionalized where rules and boundaries are inevitable, right? And thinking those two things together, if I had a solution to that, we would already have solved the problem. But it's an important thing to think about, because as you said, we actually live in a moment where this is not an intellectual question or an important question, but one that is life and death for people, but also for the field itself. I think, what will it be like to listen to this podcast in 20 years? Will there be a thing,
right.
Black Studies? And what has Black Studies done to make sure that it persists? Yeah.
That's right.
And that question of the persistence of Black Studies, so it's a rough segue to this next question. I actually wonder, and this is a difficult question to ask in the present moment. This is, what is it? January 24th. Far right government inaugurated has already basically overturned the Civil Rights Act by executive order. But I nevertheless want to ask this question about what would be an indicator of the success of Black Studies in the future. It's kind of futurist question. Because I think one of the things that Black Studies has really done well, that a couple of people in the podcast have said sort of almost to its own detriment, is to transform so many disciplines. That especially I think English departments, but also history, sociology, philosophy, art history, to change the problem that lay at its origins, which is these disciplines don't study or center on Black life, to the point where, a literature department teaches so many different forms of Black literature, I think, almost by habit and rule. And if that continues and you see these disciplines, move Black life and its study to their center, is the ultimate success of Black Studies to have done that, to have transformed the disciplines to the point where actually Black Studies isn't needed anymore? Or, and this goes to the question of methodology maybe that you've gestured towards a few times, is there something distinctive about Black Studies? Right? As much as we may not want to sort of hem it in and have some sort of enclosure and gatekeeping, is there something distinctive about Black Studies that the sign of its success in the future would be precisely that it has a definition of itself that cannot be absorbed into other disciplines?
Yeah, it's a big question. And it's also one coincidentally, that I think that we've engaged in American studies as well. I don't know if you know, I'm the president-elect of the American Studies Association at a time when the discipline of American studies, I think, is shrinking in the United States. I don't think there will ever be a new department of American studies formed in the United States, but outside of the United States, in Europe and the Middle East, there's likely to be lots of American studies departments, because in those parts of the world, people continue to need to study this thing called America and the U.S. empire. But American studies interventions, just like Black studies interventions, as you say, are being taken up in its allied institutional departments, from philosophy to political science to sociology to English and history and beyond. And that doesn't necessarily mean a crisis, I think, for the discipline. What I think makes Black studies different than, say, American studies is that Black studies has also been, and this is a point that I think Earl Lewis makes, Black studies has also been a mode of Black life in the ways that it was practiced prior to its institutionalization. That is, in the ways that it is taken up in Black bookstores throughout the United States, the ways it's taken up in Black art and culture and expressive culture, in the ways that it is taken up in Black everyday life. And in that regard, I don't see Black studies getting fully incorporated into the institution. So it is both a success and a miracle that Black studies is getting its due in all of these disciplines that formerly perhaps didn't take up those questions. But I don't see it being eclipsed by that moment. A separate question is, though, what happens to the departments, to the majors, to the institutional formations of the discipline? And that's one that I think is likely to, I think we're likely to see a lot of change and transformation in that. It is something that happens to academic formations. It's one where, the departments, the majors are under attack right now, not just from Trumpist fascists, but also from I would say, other sort of more mainstream or even progressive institutions or institutional forces that see the discipline as, having low majors or not needed. And in an academic world where we're being told that our main purpose is to offer a job to someone at the end, I think all of the sort of humanities and interdisciplinary fields are facing a moment of, if not crisis, at least ongoing transformation. So this is a very long-winded way of saying is that I see Black studies enduring both outside the academy, but also perhaps in new formations within the academy. Maybe not under the banner of African American, Africana, Black world studies, but in other kinds of formations, maybe in ethnic studies, maybe in critical race and ethnic studies. We are beginning, I think, to see new academic formations in places like the University of Chicago, right, or at Tufts University, where there are new institutional departments. And so I kind of see insurgent fields like Black studies as playing a game of whack-a-mole with the institutions. They have a horizon of maybe 20 years. And when they become too radical or too difficult for an institution to incorporate, they move on to different places. And so I don't think that's going to stop.
That's a wonderful answer. Thank you. It was extremely thoughtful, and the analogy with American studies, I think, is really worth thinking about. I think actually that kind of comparative work, I don't know what you would call it, comparative thoughts on area studies work or something, make a really interesting edited volume or just some sort of formal series of conversations, because there's so much to think through around the question of, Black studies has an intellectual tradition at its heart, as well as like a sort of critical politics and so forth. And so what it means when it moves around to other things that are less concerned with that, but also then incorporate so much of Black studies, or Black studies reinventing itself on the social scientist model, these kinds of things. These movements reshape and redefine the field, allow it to survive. But there's always that question when you reshape, what's lost, what's discarded, what's gained. So That was a fantastic response. Thank you.
Well, thank you.
So let me ask a final question. And I mean, I think in some ways you've spoken to this question multiple times, but ask it directly as a way of wrapping up. What is the issue in a Black studies context? What is the issue or the question you want us all to be thinking about?
I guess I'm still interested in thinking or asking the question of what Black studies, or what Robinson called the Black radical tradition, has to provide for us as a resource for thinking about the present conjuncture. And so I am still committed to the idea that an analysis of racial capitalism and the usable paths of Black experiments in working its way beyond racial capitalism provide a sort of palimpsest or a cipher for working our way out of the present conjuncture, where it seems that both imperialism and fascism are transforming and ascendant. The Black anti-imperialist and Black anti-fascist tradition, I think, provides me a sort of theory for thinking through it. And I still think that's a critical necessity. I guess a second area or related area is to continue to think with Black studies about its global conditions and about the geopolitical conjunctures within which it's produced and in which it thinks. I believe that Black studies offers resources for thinking through, as I said, climate catastrophe, genocide, and global imperialism. And I think that it's not the exclusive field to do that, but in thinking about the ways that Black people have survived the catastrophes, as well as thinking about the ways that Black people have produced beauty and meaning and counter-modernist practices, those have to be compasses for our itinerary at the moment.
I love that. That's it's a fantastic place to end, and I think really good testimony to what's possible in Black studies, but also that question of, are we doing that work? Are we placing ourselves, or are we forcing our way into these conversations? And that's as a question, and that's urgent, that we should all be asking. I really love that. And this has been a fantastic conversation, Alex. I really appreciate your time and your thoughtfulness and seriousness in this around the really key issues in between American studies and Black studies and in Black studies across this conversation. Just really happy to have you on the series. So thank you for all that.
My pleasure. And thanks for creating this platform and for inviting me to it.
All right. Well, great to have you on, and have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, you too.
All right. Bye-bye.